Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also check out that on Google, Spotify, Apple, and plenty of other podcast platforms. And most importantly, though, you can also check it out at Sonic Cinema. Also, check out the Sonic Cinema Patreon. Last month, I went through the growth of the James Bond character during the Daniel Craig years, and this month I'm going to be talking about the Tommy Jarvis trilogy in the middle of the Friday the 13th series. That's at patreon.com/SonicCinema. And I do also do some live streaming on twitch.tv/ScuttleLemur, so it's been a bit erratic, but I hope to have you check that out when I'm on there. So it's this past July, and it's a shame that I feel like I need to start this episode like this. This past July, we lost the director Richard Donner, who's been a favorite of mine for a number of years, and because we were, and I say it's a shame that we have to start this way because I've actually, my guest and I have been talking about doing this episode for well over a year now, and it is a discussion of the Omen Trilogy from 1976, which Richard Donner began with that classic film through 1981, and Omen III, The Final Conflict. Join me to discuss the film, and it's going to be funny. We're going to probably be discussing a lot of the same things we discussed in July with when Richard Donner passed away. And joining me on the podcast, though, is Phil Fasso. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you, as always, for having me, Brian.
It's interesting that it seems like more than any other franchise, and even action franchises, it feels like horror is the most prone to franchises. And I think part of that is because of the fact that obviously there's marketing, there's box office success for studios who want to just cash in on something that was cheap to make and made a lot of money. But it's interesting, the idea of franchises in the horror genre goes all the way back to the Universal horror movies of the 1930s and 40s. The Omen Trilogy, and there's actually a TV movie in addition to this, in addition to the 2006, the lousy 2006 remake that's basically just a new version of the 1976 film. The Omen Trilogy is kind of interesting because of the fact that it's got a natural progression to it, but at the same time, you could also see the first film just being kind of a one-off that happened to be a big hit. Phil, what is it about this franchise that resonated with you so much?
Well, I'll talk to you about Friday the 13th real quickly, okay? So, Friday the 13th, this is why I love the Omen Trilogy. Friday the 13th is the perfect example of a franchise that is a flat line, okay?
Mm-hmm.
It technically follows the adventures of Jason Voorhees, not really the first film, obviously, which is set up for later, but the greatest character development you have over 12 films, I guess it is, in the Friday the 13th, is when Jason comes back as a zombie. So the only real progression he has is he dies and comes back. It's a flat line.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Omen Trilogy, you have an actual progression for the character. Like there's growth from movie to movie. Now, obviously, there's gaps and time changes and he ages along the way, but you're following a character's progression and his maturation, and that maturation toward basically the Armageddon and the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it starts off with a 5-year-old who's basically here to bring hell on earth, and the kid's not even aware of it. And I don't think there could be a more frightening concept to me in all of horror than that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the movies, the quality of the movies after the first one are not quite up to the same level, and we'll talk about that as we get into it.
Yeah.
But as a franchise, I love it. I think it's great, and it's always been my favorite horror franchise.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you and I have gone back and forth as I've watched the sequels, and this is my first time watching anything beyond the Richard Donner film. It's like you and I have gone through it, and you and I kind of see the sequels in terms of their relative quality very much the same way, and so it's interesting to hear this is your favorite movie horror franchise in that respect. But honestly, I kind of understand it because of the fact that the Omen, the 1976 movie, which turns 45 this year, is such a powerful statement out of the gate that even if the second and third films in the series don't quite stick the landing the way that you would hope they would, it's like you said, it's that maturation, that interest in Damien as he's going towards his destiny and bringing the end times, that really is the compelling driving force of the trilogy. So yes, obviously taken as individual movies, the quality of 2 and 3 don't necessarily hold up to what we got in the original, but at the same time, you're more interested in, well, what is this movie doing in terms of developing Damien further? And Friday the 13th. I mean, you made a good, and that is a very good point. Although, as I said, I mean, patrons will get my thoughts on the Tommy Jarvis trilogy, which is one of the most weird digressions a franchise has ever gone to. It's like, oh, in the middle of this 8 and 10 movie arc, we're going to have a little trilogy here too. There's a lot to talk about, and it's funny because I haven't seen 2 parts of that trilogy in a long time, so I'm looking forward to those rewatches. But it's like it's the thing that I think one of the things that's really kind of interesting about this is that this is really the start of horror movies starting to get franchised again. Because, I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre hadn't had a sequel yet. Psycho had not had its sequels yet. And then the Damien, the Omen II, came out around the same time as Halloween did. And then Omen 3 came out a year after Friday the 13th. So, I mean, you're starting to see this modern idea of what horror is really seep into this franchise, even though it very much is still in the same vein of Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist in terms of how they sort of bring the supernatural into horror.
Well, I've read a lot about this, and part of the reason is that, you get this whole reemergence of Satan in movies, and it's kind of I guess it's pretty much the beginning of the satanic panic era in horror movies and movies in general.
Mm-hmm.
And a part of that is the turmoil that's going on in the country at the time in America. You have the whole Nixon scandal, you have Watergate, you have gas prices going through the roof. And they kind of make reflections on that in The Omen when Jennings is talking to Robert, about how the world's kind of on a downslide at that point. And I think that it's easy if you're going to go into the supernatural realm, to say, hey, listen, the world is in a terrible spot right now, and basically this would be the perfect time for Satan to slide in and take over.
Yeah. Well, and it's
So a
fun.
big part of it is what's going around at the time in the environment politically in the world and whatnot. And I think that's a big part of why those movies became so popular.
Well, and it is funny because of the fact that, I mean, it was like the Omen, to a certain extent, it precedes, like, I've read a lot about Satanic Panic over the past few years because of the fact that I've been intrigued by how much of that is sort of replicated in the QAnon conspiracy theory going around, and how basically QAnon is essentially just a modern day version of Satanic Panic. And it's funny because of the fact that the Omen movies really almost precede the rise of Satanic Panic in America, but at the same time, you did have the moral majority, you did have people like Jerry Falwell and other televangelists starting to exert their influence on American culture. And so, yeah, I mean, it's completely informed by that. But I mean, The Omen is a movie that is also, you can see it as, oh, this is the Exorcist was one of the biggest horror movies ever made. Let's see what we can do as far as combining faith and horror and religion into this idea. And the part of the reason why the first Omen works so well, and we can go ahead and get into the first Omen, is the fact that they did make that such an intriguing idea, and they also made it as much of a mystery as they did a horror movie. And I think that's one of the most important aspects to why The Omen works as well as it does.
Well, building on what you said before we get into the actual film, I don't think that The Omen exists without Rosemary's Baby, and I don't think that The Omen exists without The Exorcist. But here's why The Omen resonates with me more than those flicks. Okay, the Rosemary's Baby is basically about a woman who's going to give birth to a devil child, right? And it's one kid.
Yeah.
When you get to The Exorcist, which I've never been a fan of, but that's a whole different story. When you get to The Exorcist, it's about one 12, 13-year-old girl being possessed and some priest trying to come and clean it out, right?
Yeah.
Those are basically isolated incidents that affect a few people.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas The Omen is talking about bringing hell on earth, the end of days, and this is the end for all of us because of one child. So, yeah, I don't think The Omen would exist without those flicks, but I also think it ups the level considerably.
Yeah. No, that is an excellent point. It's been a while. Admittedly, it's been a while since I've seen Rosemary's Baby, and I go back to The Exorcist every few years or so during the month of October. And but yeah, this was the first. So it's funny because you and I both had the same kind of impulse to watch The Omen the day Richard Donner passed away. And now, granted, part of the reason why I watched it was because I knew this discussion was coming up, and so I wanted to at least get that process started of watching the movies. And then it's funny, like you messaged me later as we were, you messaged me later in the night, and it's like, man, I really wish we were having that Omen discussion. So that's kind of how our live stream talking about Richard Donner got going, because of the fact that it's like I was already interested in talking about Richard Donner on the live stream the night after he passed away, and then you came in with like, oh man, I wish we were having that discussion. It's like, well, you want to join me? And so we had really lovely discussion on Richard Donner, and you can listen to that. That is on the YouTube Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel, so you can listen to that. Richard Donner is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. I always hoped that we would get one more movie out of him after 16 Blocks. And it's funny because this is one of his most famous movies, but it's also one of the ones that I'm not as familiar with because I haven't revisited it quite that much. And then when I found a box set that had the trilogy on it, it's like, oh, okay, well, I mean, we're gonna be talking about the Omen, so I might as well pick this up. And then rewatching it, I was so much. I don't know what was the first time that I respected it and I really liked it. I don't think I loved it. This time I really loved it. And really, it boils down to seeing just the brute force authenticity of what Donner puts on camera. Because even though this is a very weird, wild, supernatural experience, is also played very genuinely because it plays, in addition to the religious aspect, in addition to the idea of, oh my God, my son is the Antichrist, it also deals with, and this is a huge part of the reason why I think the film works as much as it is. My son that something happened and my son is not my son. And I think that is one of the things that works so well. And that's part of the reason why having Gregory Peck in the role of Thorn is so important, because of the fact that he can sell that anxiety around his children. And I think that is just brilliant.
Well, two things on that. First, I found it fascinating back when I got my first DVD player in 2000, I think it was. Yeah, it was 2000. And the Omen Trilogy hadn't come out yet. That was at the cusp of DVDs. So I was waiting for all my favorites to come out. Like, some of them were already out, but a lot of them I had to wait on. So when I got the Omen Trilogy, that I believe I bought it on Halloween that year, and I watched the whole thing. But the documentaries are fascinating especially because, I'm looking at the Omen since I'm a little kid and saw it the first time as a horror movie. Richard Donner never really saw it that way.
Yeah.
Richard Donner saying, hey, you know what? What if this is just the worst day in the guy's life? His kid dies. His wife is going to be devastated. She's probably never going to be able to have kids again. And he takes this kid, and then he's got to live this life, because the whole thing is that had he been upfront about it with her, this would be a whole different thing. Had he not accepted the kid, this would have been a whole different thing.
Yeah.
So Richard Donner doesn't even look at it as it's a horror movie. Richard Donner looks at it as if, hey, this guy made a bad decision and he's living with that. And this is a series of coincidences that don't necessarily say that this is the devil's kid at all. Now, I don't look at it that way, right? I don't look at it that way at all. I look at it as, hey, this is hell on earth. This kid's got to be put away. Someone should stab him with these 7 blades and end them, But the whole thing is that Gregory Peck, at the time that he took the role, had just lost his son. His son, I believe, was suicide. I could be wrong on that, but I know his son had recently died. And, Richard Donner was like, I can't, this is a script where this guy is going to end himself trying to kill the kid. I can't present this to him. And Peck's agent said, look, let me show it to him and see what he thinks. I think, because he hasn't acted since his son died, he's taken some time off, I think he might be interested. And he was, and he took the role. Mm-hmm. And that casting, not just him, you have him, you have Billy Whitelaw, you have Lee Remick, you have some great actors in that movie that up the level on it incredibly, because they're not playing it like some garbage, cheap horror movie. They're playing it like this is a real film, But having Peck cement that as Robert Thorne is aces for that movie. Mm-hmm. And if you had a different actor playing it, I will talk about Bill Holden in the second one. But if you have a different actor playing that role, I think that you're rolling the dice on it being a much lesser movie, because Gregory Peck is a great actor and he's absolutely committed to that role.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And, I had forgotten that the film essentially starts off with the lie that Peck tells his wife that this is their son. I had forgotten about that. And in the back of my head throughout the film, I'm wondering, it's like, so as things start to progress, it's like, do we think that their actual, instead of dying in childbirth, do we think that their actual child was killed instead? And you kind of find out that that is kind of what happened. And it's just the fact that this is built on mystery that Peck has to find out, and it's one of the reasons. Well, I mean, it's one of the reasons that one of the key choices in Damien Omen II works so well, but it's also one of the reasons that I think that movie is also kind of very frustrating because of the fact that essentially is rehashing the same level of discovery in the original, and not really giving us a chance to not really giving the characters a chance to be characters in their own right. But yeah, I had forgotten the lie that Peck has to tell his wife, and it's just such a great touch. And the screenplay in this movie is as much of a key as Donner's direction, and it really just captures it captures exactly what you kind of hope this Richard Donner movie will capture, which is a degree of authenticity. And that's one of the great things that, and like you said, the idea that he looked at this as a domestic drama more than a horror movie, it says everything.
Well, yeah, it's definitely about the approach. And Richard Donner had, he'd done a bunch of TV before this. He'd done, I think, a few movies. I know that there's a movie called, I think it's Salt and Pepper that he did with, because that preceded this as well. But this is Richard Donner's big break. Yeah. I mean, this is him coming into his own, and then from this he gets Superman, and then everything rolls from Superman. So I mean, it's great that a great director was able to, and this is his really only foray into horror.
Yeah,
he locked in like George Romero and John Carpenter. A lot of those guys come out with a big horror movie, sometimes their first movie, and then all of a sudden that's their career, and they can't break out. Richard Donner was able to do pretty much anything. I mean, look at his movies. He did, following the Omen, which is a horror flick, he did probably the greatest superhero movie of all time. And, you can look at Marvel and DC universes today, and you can draw a direct line from Superman in 1978.
Oh, yeah.
He makes action flicks. He makes the Lethal Weapon series after this. He makes Goonies, which is a kid adventure. He's able to do all kinds of stuff. And like you said earlier, it's a shame that he didn't get one last movie out before he passed. But his catalog is just, we're blessed that he was able to do as much as he did in the time he was given.
Yeah, and even a lot of even some of his other movies that aren't as well known, like he did a lovely little character drama in 1980 called Inside Moves. And I mean, it's funny because it had to have been made after he got fired from Superman 2, quote unquote Superman 2, because they filmed the two. They were essentially filming the two back to back. I mean, you kind of feel that he's sort of working his way through those emotions of what happened with that experience. And you mentioned that it's like, he wasn't around necessarily. He wasn't around for the Omen 2, but he was an executive producer actually on the Omen 3. And I think that's part of the reason, and we'll get to it, but I mean, it's part of the reason why I think Omen 3 probably is more successful than the Omen 2, because of the fact that Donner was at least back in some capacity to sort of go, oh, this is probably how this narrative should work. And but yeah, he was just such a wonderful actor. He's such a wonderful filmmaker, and I mean, everything I heard about him was just, he was the nicest guy and such a talented filmmaker. I mean, he would have thrived in the earlier Hollywood, and it's kind of a shame that he didn't really that like as the superhero franchise that the superhero landscape that, as you said, and he basically helped pave the way for with Superman the movie. He just didn't really have a place in that Hollywood.
Yeah, but the thing is that Donner's career, I think Donner's career was even better because of that, because he was able to do so much and able to do so many different types of things. He never got typecast in anything, never got caught up in any particular genre. And it's just like I could see him being a great horror director because The Omen is just out of the blocks. It's just a stellar film.
Yeah.
And part of that is because, we talked about Rosemary's Baby and we talked about The Exorcist before. And part of the thing with The Exorcist is I've never been able to get into it, partially because it's about this foul-mouthed, you have a 12, 13-year-old who's foul-mouthed. She's masturbating with a cross. She's spewing fucking, pardon my language, she's spewing vomit, green pea soup all over the place. The Omen is not that. The Omen is the exact opposite of that. Even though it's got some brutal deaths in it, The Omen is a classy movie.
Yeah.
From actors to the writing to the way it's shot to the score by Jerry Goldsmith, everything about it is just next level class. It's a classy film. Mm-hmm. I think that's directly related to Donner because, Donner comes from an earlier generation where, films weren't. And we talked about Omen II and III. We'll get into those later. But the whole thing is that it's not just a gore fest. It's not, it's not just a horror movie. It's a real movie. It's a film,
Yeah, and the story basically just builds. That first death in the movie is very intense and very sudden. It's not gory. And then the way they build the character of Damien, the way that performance builds, that maybe we're starting to see some of this malevolence that he's supposed to have, and it's interesting. Like it's probably one of the best sort of unheralded child performances. Like you don't really hear when you hear about great child performances, you don't really hear about The Omen that much, but you probably should because of the fact that performance is so effective, and that performance just conveys so much in the character. That performance has to go up against people like Lee Remick and Gregory Peck, and it does.
I think part of the reason that Harvey Stevens doesn't get everyone thinks of Damien when they think, devil kids and stuff, but they never really think of the performance, is that he's got almost no dialogue in the entire film.
Yeah.
Which is really strange because he's 5 years old at that point, and 5-year-olds normally, they're old enough to talk, but he almost never says anything. He's a very, he's kind of like a blank slate, which makes him even scarier because he could be any kid at that point,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and I think I didn't even think about the fact that he doesn't really say anything, because you're right, like 5-year-olds at that age, they're very chatty, which, it shows just how off from everything Damien is. And, if we're talking about the Omen trilogy in a progression of the character of Damien, like, the Omen is one of the ideal places. Is having him at that age, obviously, it's like, they've lived with this kid for 5 years, and but they're just now all of a sudden these weird things are happening now, and it's one of those things where it just you see the progression from Damien in this film, and then you see the Omen Part 2. I mean, seeing as though we're talking about the trilogy in general, I mean, we can, we can sort of talk about it in not necessarily in linear order, but Damien in the Omen 2 is, it's one of those things where it's like I sort of complained to you where I felt like he should have been much more front and center in the movie compared to where he was in the actual movie. Like Damien, it's called Damien the Omen 2. Why is Damien not the main character of the movie? Why are we following William Holden's character, who, oh, by the way, he happens to be the brother of Gregory Peck's character? That's very convenient. And and he essentially has this same. He basically has the same arc that Peck did in the first one, but at the same time, we're also seeing going back and forth with Damien at military school, and you start to see him have these realizations, have these surprises about his natural being, and then he has a revelation about his true place in the world. And it's like there's nothing personal in this movie to ground it like there was in the first one. And thankfully in the Omen 3 he's an adult, he's basically the main character, and he also happens to be played by Sam Neill, who is just such a fantastic actor. So we're naturally going to get great work from him in that one.
So I'll tell you a little bit about William Holden. William Holden is one of my favorite actors, and I think that what happened with him and the Omen trilogy just doesn't work for a particular reason, right? So before they went to Peck, they went to a whole bunch of different veteran actors to ask them if they wanted to take part in the Omen and play Robert Thorne. William Holden was on that list, and they offered him the role, and William Holden turned it down. Now, Holden's career was on a downslide at that point.
Yeah.
1981, SOB's a hysterical flick. It's one of my favorite Bill Holden flicks. It's so odd because it's Blake Edwards, and it's it's a seething. It goes back all the way back to Hollywood. What do you call it? Sunset Boulevard, because it's a scathing look at the inside of Hollywood, and it's a perfect way for Holden to end his career. But Holden's gonna slip. Holden's gonna get drunk in about a year or so after the Omen II comes out, or maybe 2-3 years, and he's gonna hit his head on a dresser, and he's gonna die. He's going to bleed out, basically, because he's an alcoholic. So he's in a bad spot in his career at this point. He's on the downslide. He wanted to get nominated for the Oscar. Actually, he might have been nominated for, he was nominated, I think, for, I can't remember. The one with the news movie that they made, the famous one that Patty Krzyzewski wrote.
Network.
Well, anyway, he was nominated. Network, yes. He was nominated for Network, but the guy who played the Open Your Windows, we're not going to take it anymore, that guy died. And I read in Holden's biography that Holden, as soon as he died, was like, oh my God, I'm not going to win this Oscar now. They're going to give it to him. So seeing how successful The Omen was and how many people went to see it and how popular a flick it was, once he found out that Damien Omen II was going to come on, he jumped and went to Fox and said, listen, I want this role.
Yeah. So
I don't think, as much as I love William Holden, I don't know if it would have been the same with his performance had he been in the Omen. Mm-hmm. I think that's something we don't want to tamper with, because Peck did such a great job. But I also think that in Damien Omen II, it follows Holden's character. Holden looks lost the entire film.
Yeah.
He looks like he's disengaged. He looks like, why am I here? What am I doing? And you can see it in his performance. Mm-hmm. Now, a huge part of why Damien Omen II doesn't work for me is because half the freaking film is about Thorne Industries.
Yeah.
I don't care about them selling grain to Europe. I don't care about them seeding fields in India to keep the Indian, to help spurt the economic growth in India. It's so freaking boring. It's so boring. And then it's like, okay, well, Thorn Industries is run by this guy who happens to have the devil's kid while he's the mid-period of his finding out about, his awakening about being the devil. Like, it just, none of the individual elements work.
No.
And why is Damien in a military school? Like, the military school thing really doesn't play into it at all. Okay, so you have Lance Henriksen. Henriksen is great in the limited time he's on screen. And he's the one who kind of says, hey, Damien, read the Bible and you'll find out what this is all about, why you're feeling the way you feel. But really, none of it, it just comes unglued very quickly, and none of it really works.
No, and the thing is, it's like, I mean, yeah, there's absolutely no reason for the Thorn Industries stuff at all. There really isn't. Like, it doesn't necessarily build to anything in particular because of the fact that, after the reporter tells like his business partner that he talked to her, and then he takes the phone call, and then it's funny because it's like before her death, it's like the business partner comes back, it's like, oh, he's so upset. It's like, well, why is he upset? Why is he so upset about something? And we never find that out. The reporter's death is absolutely absurd in this movie. In that movie, it's absolutely hilarious. And one thing that is interesting about this movie is that you have acolytes on both sides of the equation. You have the religious people who are seeing this prophecy sort of unfold, and then you have the acolytes of the Antichrist, and it seems like Lance Henriksen is one of them because he like you said, he kind of tells Damien, it's like, oh, hey, check out the Bible, check out this, check this out, and you'll understand what's going on. And I will say, it's like the school scene where, I will say one of the scenes that's really good about the military school is that the scene where the teacher's testing him on all the dates. And it's like, obviously there's no kid ever who would know all of those dates. And so you start to see some of this otherworldly information that Damien holds in him that nobody in real life would ever be able to would necessarily be able to spout out when they're 12 years old, because he's 5 in the Omen. There's a pointless prologue where the only people who seem to be truly aware of Damien die, and then it cuts to 7 years later. So yeah, he's 12 in this. And I think, and one of the things that you brought up, which is when we were going back and forth, is that he really should be older. I mean, especially going to military school, that would make much more sense if he'd been like 18 or 19, because he's 32 in the final conflict.
Yes.
That would make much more sense.
Well, the whole thing is, and when we're going back and forth, I told you that was Harvey Bernard produced all 3 of the Omens and the 4th one, but that's a whole different story. Anyway, Harvey Bernard said that his one big criticism is that Damien should have been older. Like he said, hey, there's not much you can do with a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
And I think the actor, I don't know how old the actor was, but he looks like he's old. He looks like he's 13 or 14. He looks a little older than 12. But the whole thing is that, it's supposed to, like, even the idea of awakening, you'd think would come with puberty, which 12 years old just doesn't do it. It doesn't, like, I told you, none of it works. It just falls apart very quickly.
So he was born in 1962, so he would have been 16 when Damien came out. Now, Grant, I mean, now you brought up something that I actually thought about as well, and the idea that, the only way that this kind of works is that, Damien learning who he truly is akin to puberty. It's like, if that's the metaphor that you're playing with there, Damien really needs to be the main character of the movie then, because it's got to be about Damien. It can't be about Thorn. It just makes no sense.
Well, see, it works with the first one because, like, even when he hits, like, it's really interesting if you watch the scene where Lee Remick gets knocked over the balcony.
Yeah.
Because, like, he's riding along on his bicycle, and at that point, Mrs. Baylock is in there. So she is obviously the apostate. She's the one who's, there to make sure that Damien is raised up properly. Which is why she keeps bringing, she brings a dog into the house and flips out. She keeps trying to parent him and make decisions that shouldn't be hers to make, and Thorn keeps getting pissed off, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, she opens the door and lets him into the hallway. He rides his bike, right? He rides his little tricycle, and he hits now, why should he be standing on a table over a 20-foot fall for a balcony hanging a plant? That's a bad decision to begin with.
Yes.
But the whole thing is he hits the thing, and then she catches the banister, right?
Mm.
And she's like, "Oh my God, help me, Damien!" And he kind of looks at her, but he's 5 years old, so it's not like he's going to be able to lift her and save her from it anyway.
Yeah.
But the interesting part is once she hits the ground and Damien sees what happens, he starts crying, and he runs away. Because that's what a little kid would do, And not only that, I mean, we know this isn't his mother, but he doesn't know that. He thinks this is mom,
Yeah.
Now, when you get to the Damien Omen II, not only does Damien not know what his powers are, I don't know what the freak his powers are at that point. There's no... the whole thing with the first one is, okay, he's subconsciously or unconsciously knocking off all the people who are getting in his way and trying to eliminate him, right? Mm-hmm. So the priest goes, the photographer goes, eventually Gregory Peck goes, his mother goes, everyone who gets in his way is going to, and the priest says to him in the park, he says, listen, he's going to kill everyone who you love, and when he's done with all that and he thinks he can get your power, he's going to kill you. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
And of course, that's exactly what happens. Problem is, in Damien Omen 2, Damien's goals are undefined because he really doesn't have any goals.
Yeah.
His powers are undefined. So what are his powers? Well, apparently he's got a crow now that can watch him, so he's become Eric Draven from The Crow, which is a bad enough decision. And that, again, that scene with, you could tell that Donner didn't direct Damien Omen 2 just watching that scene with the reporter getting hit by the truck.
Yeah.
It's gaudy. It's so bad. And you can see the dummy flying, and it looks like a dummy. It's awful. It's so bad, Ryan.
Oh, it's terrible.
But the problem is that, you get to the point where I guess he really loves his cousin, and he thinks his cousin is going to turn on him because his cousin's like, no, you're evil. And then he kind of force crushes his cousin's mind with Jedi powers. I don't even know.
Yeah.
I've seen the movie 20 times. I have no idea. So if you're going to show that he's maturing to that point, how about showing me how the maturation actually works?
Yeah.
And a big part of it is, a lot of it is rerun from the first film, like you said, because, hey, listen, we got to have the mystery there where Richard Thorne's trying to figure out what happened. But we already know the mystery at this point. We know everything.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't need to follow that mystery, and we don't need to follow that because we already know what happens because we've seen the first one. So, and then the thing is, you got to build in now. You got to build in. See, the thing about the first one is the first one builds the high spots with the horror scenes, right? With the death. So there's a lot going on, and then it builds, and then you have a death. And even the deaths, they're pretty gruesome. But as far as horror movies go, they're also pretty restrained. And again, that goes into the whole, this is a classy movie thing.
Yeah.
This is not just some cheap-ass horror, And a lot of it is these scenes are so well done because, Richard Donner directed them. And he put them together and storyboarded them, and it's a reflection on him. You get to the Omen II, and again, some of it's pretty cool. Like the guy trapped under the ice is pretty frightening.
Yeah.
And then following him, them running along the ice and him at the same speed and trying to follow him. You see him floating down the river. Like some of that's pretty creepy.
Yeah.
But so much of it is just poorly done. Like Aunt Marion gets killed by a crow. I don't even know what happens to Aunt Marion. She just has a heart attack. The crow scares her to death. I mean, it's just so bad.
And when Lee Grant comes in to look at her, it's like she's got this look on her where it's like, oh, come on. There's no way it's just a heart attack. Come on. That is such an absurd... Like, how many people have a pose like that when they have a heart attack? It only happens in horror movies. It only happens in horror movies. It only happens in cheesy horror movies. But, I mean, I will say, yeah, the reporter's death is absurd. The doctor dying near the end in the elevator is just bonkers. Like, it looks cheap. It looks like it's just moving up behind. It looks like it's just an elevator against a rear screen that's moving, that's projecting the background. The background is absurd. And then you can't possibly... What elevator is not strong enough to withstand the cable going through it?
So they obviously wanted to up the gore factor in this movie, right?
Yeah.
That's a big part. Obviously, and again, we talked about this the other day. Part of the problem, I think, is that the first movie is Richard Donner's movie, right?
Yeah.
And Omen is definitely Richard Donner's. After he leaves and decides not to come back for Omen II because he's on his way to a stellar career, those films become Harvey Bernard.
Yeah.
Harvey Bernard, the producer, and Harvey Bernard does not have the artistry or the sensibilities that Richard Donner has.
No.
So, it's kind of funny because, like you said, those death scenes, they kind of predate what's coming with the 80s stuff, with all the Friday the 13th and all the ultra gore and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then by the time you hit the third one, well, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but by the time you hit the third one, some of the stuff in the final conflict just leans into that whole, all right, well, it's a gore fest now,
Yeah.
But let's talk about Lee Grant's nonsensical turn at the end that makes absolutely no sense.
No, it doesn't. And it's like, at the beginning of that, when that happens, I'm like, oh, well, that's an interesting twist. And then, of course, Damien freaking sets her on fire. It's like, why? It's like, I mean, okay, I understand. How is, so she basically let the die and then he kills her. It's absolute nonsense. And it's like the only way, I think this movie, I understand it to a certain extent. You want to explain what happened to Damien, who's taking care of Damien. I think the best, if this movie truly wanted to work and like Damien is at this age or dealing with the puberty metaphor, the best way this movie works is if it's just following Damien at military school.
Yeah,
if
like how about putting
that,
more than how about
forget the rest of this.
How about putting more than 3 scenes of him at the school? Because I think you get about 3 scenes.
Just have Damien at the military school, with his cousin, and just follow that. That's because you've named the movie after him. Make him the main character, for crying out loud. You don't need to, because I mean, in the Omen III, like the conflict of interest between Damien and Thorn Industries is basically already like taken care of by the time he's the ambassador. And it's like it's just, you don't need all of that legwork. I mean, I get, if you've got somebody like William Holden saying, I want to be in this, it's like, okay, fine, make him like the principal or the headmaster at the school then.
Well, okay, so they obviously wanted to get see, you had Gregory Peck and you had Lee Remick in the first one. So you had the Oscar prestige, right?
Yeah.
So now you have William Holden, who's the Best Actor winner, and you have Lee Grant, who I think at that point had already won an Oscar for Shampoo. So again, it's the whole, well, how do we justify them in this script?
Yeah.
Okay, well, now we're going to do this whole family thing and that's the whole setup. You were talking about the scene at the beginning. The opening is going back to Bugenhagen, who shows up very briefly in the Omen in the first one and basically explains to Damien, explains to Thorne, hey, listen, your kid's evil. This is what you need to do to get rid of him. Otherwise, it's going to be hell on earth.
Yeah.
Right? So you bring Bugenhagen back because, hey, listen, we're all calling for Bugenhagen's story to be finished. We all need to know what happens to him after the first one, right?
Yeah.
So you have that whole thing where him and his archaeology buddy, it's like 6 weeks after Thorne dies, and they see the newspaper and all that, the kid. And it's like, okay, so they find this wall, and it's supposed to show the three faces of Damien during his maturation.
Yeah.
So there's a painting of Harvey Stevens from the first one, and you find out that, his kids, the 12-year-old version is painted on the wall. And I guess they hadn't hired Sam Neill, so you can't paint the older version at this point, but it's going to be a trilogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, do I really need that whole scene, 10 minutes worth of opening the film, so that, William Holden can find a picture of his son, painted onto some wall from 500 years ago, whatever it was, 1,500 years ago? No, you don't need any of that.
Mm-hmm.
As far as Damien Omen II goes, every time I rewatch it, there's one cool scene that's really well done. It's right at the very beginning, and it's Damien's introduction. He's walking across the lawn of, I guess, whatever it is, their mansion compound or whatever. He's in his military uniform. And the way they film it, some guy that works for, he's a yard worker, is burning leaves at that point.
Yeah.
And you see Damien come into the shot, and you see the flames come up.
Mm-hmm.
So right there, that this is the devil. It's a cool shot. It doesn't mean much as far as the movie goes.
Yeah.
But I think had they made them older and focused on the military school thing, that would have been a much better movie.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right on all points there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's that's ultimately why Omen 3 works so much better, because it's about Damien. And
yes.
Now, part of that is also because it stars Sam Neill as Damien, which is a fantastic choice. And, even though I'm not as familiar with early Sam Neill as I am with later Sam Neill, it's I know enough about Sam Neill to know that he's a pretty great choice if you're going to cast somebody as the Antichrist. And it's you can see him really digging into that role quite effectively.
Oh, he's phenomenal. And you're never going to get a bad performance out of Sam Neill. And he owns that role. He's totally into it. He's committed. And, he makes Damien absolutely creepy as an adult.
Yeah.
The whole thing where he comes behind the Christ statue and he's fucking, it's really weird because he's like, it's almost like a sexual overtone because he's rubbing his hands on the shoulders. He's touching the points. He's touching the points on the crown of thorns, and he's basically, "Hey, I'm here now, buddy. I'm gonna own this place." And it just exudes creepiness.
Yeah, it is one of the most unsettling. It's one of the most unsettling scenes in the entire trilogy, and it's because of how well Neill plays that. And this I will say it's 25 minutes into the Omen 3, it was already much more compelling than anything we got in Omen 2. And
yes.
It just hits the ground running where it's okay, we've established that Sam Neill is Damien. Damien knows he is the Antichrist. He has some people who know he is, other people who don't know he is. And it's just a really it's well built in that respect. And
here's the thing too. Here's the thing too, though. The whole him owning Thorne Industries plays out as it's very quick. It's not like a long stretched out thing, but it also plays out because not only is he now ready to take his position, he's in a financial position where he's running a company that owns a great portion of the world right now.
Yeah.
And he's making it look like he's a good guy. Like, we're doing all this, charity stuff. Like, there's that scene where he's watching the commercial about Thorn Industries, and it's supposed to pump up how much charity work they do and how they're helping out worldwide.
Yeah.
It's off. He's like, hey, listen, any hack could have thrown this together. We need something better. So he's selling the lie, which is what the devil does. He sells the lie that he's a good person. But then he's also going to come into it, and it's really cool the way they do this. He's now going to come into his position as the ambassador to I think it's the Court of St. James, which is the position that Robert Thorne had in the original.
Yeah. So
he's going to set himself up to take his father's spot, which is exactly what the priest told Thorne in the first film. He's going to take everything you own. And it's now 25 years or whatever after Thorne's death, and he's now coming into Thorne's place.
Yeah.
And it's really nifty the way they set that up.
And the scene there, and you mentioned that in Omen II and in Omen III, the violence is considerably more brutal. It's a lot more in terms of gore. It's starting to build into what we're going to start seeing in terms of horror as in ways of the way the gore plays out, the different makeup effects and all of that. And it really kind of, and they really do kind of take on more of the structure of slasher movies than movies than sort of domestic dramas about faith and about religion. And it's like it's all basically building up to the conclusion of the Omen 3, where it's like Damien is ultimately trying to take his place as the Antichrist and bring hell upon Earth.
Absolutely. The end of days is coming, and Damien's going to be the cause of it, and then he's going to rule the world.
Which really made it kind of surprising that doesn't really seem to happen.
Well, let me talk to you real quickly about the Daggers of Megiddo here, all right? So the really cool section, I think it opens the film actually, where they show you, okay, so you get the burnt rubble from the museum that Richard and his wife were in at the end of Damien Omen II. And then they dig up the daggers, they're running through, they're cleaning out the place, they find the daggers, they dig them up, the daggers go to auction, and then a priest buys them, right? So the whole thing is, in the first one, Thorne is told, listen, you need to use these 7 daggers and use them in very specific spots in a very specific order in order not just to expel the kid's life, but expel Satan out of the body, right?
Yeah.
So go through this whole process of these knives. And then you get these priests, and my friend Michael Cucinato pointed this out to me. He said this years ago, and I thought it was his line, but he said that either Michael Medved or one of those guys from the 80s, the film critics mentioned it. You get basically religion's version of the Keystone Cops with these priests that are running around and falling over themselves and falling off bridges. Like, these guys seem absolutely incompetent. But I always thought it was kind of cool that, hey, listen, now you have this whole thing with this order of priests that are trying to do what religion should do, which is, Christianity wants to expel the Antichrist. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
But you set up this thing through 3 movies now that you need these 7 daggers, and then you get to the end of the movie, and it's like, okay, so Jesus Christ just came out, and I don't really understand what happened. I think he just kind of killed Damien and took him off to the afterlife because, they don't use 7 daggers on him. And it's like, you'd think with all that buildup, even if it was just the buildup in that movie, you'd think that you'd need to use these daggers, and ultimately they just become unnecessary in the end.
Right. No, and I mean, I actually, I will say I actually do like the structure of this one, where it's like these priests who are trying to kill Damien, and they're trying to figure out where he is, and they're trying to, and it is kind of funny that the ways that they all kind of fail at that. I will say it's like the scene on the bridge during the dog hunt is really terrific. I love the way that plays out, and
The whole dog hunt scene is just the fox hunt scene is just it's a great scene.
Yeah,
the way it's set up is just amazing. And then Damien with the whole, hey, listen, you've got your first kill. Now you need the blood on your face. You know, it's absolutely creepy, but it's a great way to, it's like the first one where they build up to the high points. And that's a great high point, that film.
Mm-hmm. Now, and the tension builds really well in the final conflict. And it's just, you know, it's like it's night and day. It was night and day watching 2 and 3 because of the fact that it's like, okay, 2 is, you know, it's okay. It feels like filler. A lot of it feels like filler, and a lot of it feels repetitive from the first one for obvious reasons that we've already talked about. And then the third one is like, oh, okay, yeah, this is definitely going in a very different direction than. I mean, it's going in the natural direction, but it's also saying things up in a very different way that I can actually appreciate what it's doing here.
But it also, like, the whole point of it, and I love the fact that the first one is he's obviously oblivious because he's 5 years old and doesn't know he's the Antichrist. The second one, he finds out somewhere in the middle and then decides to turn on his death kill mode, right? Mm-hmm. So then you get to the third one, and now he's pure evil.
Yeah.
So part of his plan is to wipe out, it goes back to the Bible, it's to wipe out all the newborns because he thinks that the second coming of Christ is on its way.
Yeah.
And he basically says, hey, listen, now he's got acolytes, a whole bunch of apostates built up. It's not like he's got 1 or 2 like in the first couple films. Now he says, hey, listen, we need to go kill all the kids that were born on this particular day. Mm-hmm. So right there, that's that. Now you're into full stream evil. He's fully committed now. He knows his path and he knows what he wants to do, and he knows that he needs the power and wants the power. Now it's a power lust thing.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what the devil's always been set up to be in literature and fiction and movies and the Bible, you know?
Yeah. No, and I think this is ultimately where it's like it's I can definitely agree with you in terms of this being a pretty even though the quality of the franchise varies, it's ultimately a really great franchise because it does have even though the second one kind of stalls to a certain extent, it does have a natural progression of where it's going, and that's something you certainly don't get in Friday the 13th, except for weird little, you know, part in the middle of the series. You certainly don't get in the Halloween movies, except, you know, well, that one's just a mess in terms of continuity in general that I haven't seen enough of them to really suss out. And then you have the Nightmare on Elm Street series where, yeah, you have some character, you know, you have Nancy who comes back a couple of times in the series, but ultimately, like, Freddy's ultimately the same character. And
well, that's the whole thing, though. If you're gonna make, like, my problem with a lot of sequels and a lot of remakes and all that is you should always have a purpose. Like, things should have a reason to exist, right?
Yeah.
So if you watch the first 8 Jason, and we'll go back to Friday the 13th for a second. If you watch the first 8 Friday the 13th, which are the Paramount flicks, right?
Yeah.
It's the same movie over and over and over again, right? You get these scenes like, okay, so Jason's here. Kids went into the woods because they're dumb. Bunch of people are going to get killed violently. Jason's going to get killed at the end, and then he's going to get brought back in the next one.
Yeah.
Repeat, rinse and repeat. It's the same thing over and over again. Like, literally, Jason has no growth as a character.
No.
I'm telling you, literally, the only growth he has is you know, the only maturation, whatever you want to call it, character growth, is going from being living in the 4th one to, you know, undead in the 6th one.
Yeah.
That's funny because You get the 7th one with the psychic, you get the 8th one in New York, and you can see they're trying to reinvigorate it and do something different, and they're making the same movie just with gimmicks now. It's like,
excuse me, it's in New York for like 15 minutes, and it's not even New York, isn't it? Like Montreal or Toronto or something.
Well, yes,
like that.
that's Jason. Jason takes the boat to Vancouver. Is basically we'll
Vancouver.
Talk about that.
That's right.
But the whole thing is that in the Omen, like those movies have a reason to exist because you're talking about a character and you're showing his progression and growth and his goals and desires and why he wants to do this and how he's come about and where he wants to go and eventually whether he's going to get there or not.
Well, I mean, honestly, and what you point out, I mean, there's a reason, there's a big part of the reason that the first two Friday the 13th have always been my favorite of that series is because, first of all, it's not, obviously, as you and I both know, and most people know, it's not Jason in the first one, it's his mother. And then in the second one, it's Jason, so his mother's taking vengeance for him in the first one, and the second one is Jason taking vengeance for his mother. And I love the way that they play with that in the second one. From the third one on, it's just completely ridiculous, and he's basically one-track mind of, I'm just gonna keep killing teenagers who come into woods, and it's absolutely absurd. But no, I mean it's and I say this as somebody who has a genuine affection for that franchise as well, but I mean, I'll completely acknowledge there are some really low. Let's put it this way: the lowest points in the Omen trilogy are far better than the lowest points in the Friday the 13th series. I will simply say that. But like I have issues with the Omen 2, but I can watch Omen 2 much more than I can watch like Jason Takes Manhattan again.
Absolutely.
So
how do you feel about the ending of the final conflict?
It's it's really it's something. It makes you, it really does kind of make you think, and it's definitely a bold, it's really a bold way to bring the religious conflict of this trilogy back to the forefront, I think. And I just sat there and I was like, oh, this is quite an ending. Now, I mean, obviously, like you said, it's clearly saying everything up as far as the daggers throughout the entire trilogy. But at the same time, it's like, oh, by the way, there's this whole idea of maybe the second coming, and that's kind of what happens. And it's like, I love the imagery in the ending of the final conflict, I will say, and it goes very well. And we haven't even really brought his name back into it. It really goes well with the score by Jerry Goldsmith, who rightfully won his Oscar for the first Omen, and came back for the trilogy. And you can really, it's interesting because I feel like this would have been a franchise where very easily he could have just like sort of done copy paste of the same music he did for the first one. But I think there are some interesting thing, even though the movies are not as good as the first one, I think there are some interesting things in the music in the second and third one that actually make me think it's a pretty interesting trilogy in that respect.
Well, like you said, the interesting thing is that he didn't copy and paste. It's that there are 3 original scores.
Yeah.
And they got him, Jerry Goldsmith was one of those guys that, for his entire career, was in high demand. And they got him to be in all 3 flicks, which is great because other than Harvey Bernard as the producer and Fox as the studio, Jerry Goldsmith is the only through line, and his music is great. I used to have, I don't think I have them anymore, but I used to have all of the trilogy. It's 3 separate. I used to have the score for each of the 3 films on CD, and it was great because I could pop them in the car and listen as I was driving around and whatnot. But the music, like he makes 3 legitimate scores, you know, and they're all very nuanced, and you know, it's Jerry Goldsmith, so you can't go wrong. They're great scores, you know. And he doesn't just, you know, all right, well, I could just rehash what I did in the last one, not a problem. You know, he doesn't get into that territory. And you know, those films, like, imagine how worse that. Imagine lesser that Damien Omen II would have been without his score if they would have gotten somebody else's score, you know?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and that's the thing, like, you know, John Williams doing the score for Jaws 2, you know, and then you can definitely tell the difference between him doing Jaws 2 and then how they couldn't get him back for 3 and 4, and both of those films suffer accordingly, among many other reasons why they suffer. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I love, one of the things that's always been one of my favorite things out of Goldsmith as a composer is the way he uses just various musical effects, the way he uses synthesizers, and obviously here the way he does, the way he uses choral passages. And I mean, that's one of the most iconic. That is one of the most iconic aspects of his music for the Omen movies. And I mean, that right there. I mean, just immediately in the very simple title sequence in the first Omen, he's put you in a mood, just a really completely unsettling mood and a very sinister mood.
The Gregorian chants in the first film are just killer.
Yeah.
The Ave Satani chants, and on the DVD extras for the first film, he said that basically he wrote it like it was a black mass.
Yeah.
So instead of having Ave Maria, Hail Maria, you know, Hail Mary, it's Ave Satani, Hail Satan. And that whole thing just carries through, and it's just, I can't speak well enough about his score. I can't promote it enough. It's just great work. And he definitely was well-deserved. He won a well-deserved Oscar for it.
Yeah. I mean, he shouldn't have had to wait this long. I mean, I would have given it to him for Planet of the Apes even before this, and I would have given it to him later. I mean, he did some terrific work later, but yeah, his you know, it's interesting. It's interesting how certain genres bring something out of a composer, because I mean, he did pretty great work for Poltergeist too later.
Yes.
And you know, I think there's something about it. It's weird as standard issue as a lot of horror movies gotten this coming decade from like the Omen on. It's fascinating to see what was happening musically, because of the fact that it's like you had people like Jerry Goldsmith who brings this really bold classical approach to the Omen. You have John Williams, who uses leitmotif pretty expertly in Jaws. Then you have John Carpenter, who does something very unique with the use of synthesizers and very simple rhythms in Halloween, that's kind of building off of the type of things that Williams and Goldsmith were doing, just in a very different route. And then you have Henry Manfredini, who, as generic and as bland as the Friday the 13th franchise is, would be even more so without that iconic theme that he wrote right off the bat. And it's interesting to hear. And then you have somebody later in the decade, and then you have somebody later in Ennio Morricone working with Carpenter on this thing, and he's doing something that you're not accustomed to him doing. Even though there are elements of it that sound very similar to a lot of his music, it's also something that's very outside of the rest of his filmography. And every October I have a playlist that I go back and I listen to of like horror scores and stuff like that. And I love listening. It really brings me back to listening to some of these great pieces over the years, and just hearing how diverse the composer, how versatile the genre has been when it comes to experimental music.
Well, see, I've always said that horror is one of those places where you can really have a great score, and when you have a great score, it can totally transform a horror movie.
Mm-hmm.
And part of the problem is that, so much of it is, well, horror's made on the cheap. We don't need a great score, blah, 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 blah. But I mean, Donner did the right thing and brought in Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry Goldsmith worked on Poltergeist. And it's funny because I watched the Twilight Zone, the movie, the other night for the first time in years. And I had forgotten that he did the score for that.
Yeah.
And you can definitely hear that he's still got some Poltergeist in his system at that point, because there's definitely some stuff kicking in from there. But I mean, the score just enhances the trilogy, and it's another reason that it's a great, great trilogy. Look, like I said, the first film, absolutely my favorite horror film. Always has been, always will be. The second film and third films, do they have their ups and downs? Absolutely. But consistently as a horror and, as a horror franchise and as a trilogy and all that, it's pound for pound my favorite. It's, the first one is a classic film. It's classy. It's well made, top to bottom. Performances, writing, score, direction, and if the second and third one kind of fall off in that at points, I'm okay with that. Yeah, I can live with that.
Yeah. Well, and it basically goes to the fact that it's like, you don't have Richard Donner directing the sequels. You don't have the same writer writing the sequels, and that is kind of an issue. If you had one of those elements in place for the sequels, I think the sequels certainly, the second one probably has much more of a structure that's not just rehashing the first one. And then you see the natural progression of Damien from that 5-year-old kid to the Antichrist without the second one that kind of just kind of is spinning its wheels to a certain extent.
Well, part of the problem with the second one, too, is that they had a different director start the film, and he'd actually directed like a week's worth of film, and Harvey Bernard fired him.
Yeah.
And then Bill Holden, I forget, Graham Baker, maybe his name is?
Don Taylor.
A guy who that's it, Don Taylor.
Yeah.
Who had acted with Holden in Stalin 17. Holden's like, listen, I know this guy who can come in and direct this. And actually, around that same time, he directed the Richard, not Richard Burton, the Michael, whatever it is, the version of The Island of Dr. Moreau that came out in the 70s. So he was doing horror at that time, and they got him in. Now, did that affect the quality of the film overall? I'm sure it did at some point when you set up with a director and all of a sudden you have to switch into filming.
Yeah,
I'm sure that's not great, But also, I just think that the way it's written, that it's going to be the weak part of the entire trilogy, no matter what,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we haven't even talked really about, in terms of the first one, we haven't talked about the fantastic scenes at the monastery and the cemetery in Rome, where the truth is revealed about Damien and their son and what happened, and that scene is just it is one of the best scenes in the entire trilogy, in the way it's built, in the way it's set.
That is my favorite scene in any horror movie. It is so well done.
Yeah.
First off, you're in a cemetery at night, and it's on a stage. It's not a real cemetery, but it looks really, really good. And you have the breathing, there's these breaths, and you find out that the dogs are there, and it builds. But the whole thing is that, okay, so Thorne's come here on a quest for discovery to find out what's going on, right?
Yeah.
He's trying to figure out if this is real or not. So he picks up, they find the two graves, and he picks up the first one, and he's mortified because there's the skeleton of a little baby in there, and you can see that there is a hole in the skull. where they smashed the kid's skull in. So that goes back to the beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here's the deal. I was told that this baby just happened to be here, and my baby died during the childbirth.
Yeah.
And that's not the case, obviously, because this is. And then he says, "Oh, well, maybe if it's the mother and we pick it up and it's not, maybe this isn't my child." He's still trying to convince himself that he can win the fight. And then they pick it up, and and again, it's set up really well earlier on when the priest confronts him and gets thrown out, because he says the mother was a jackal, but you can't, something happens where the sound is kind of cut off. And you can't really, you can hear it if you listen closely.
Mm-hmm.
But then they lift up the tomb, and there is the skeleton of a jackal.
Yeah.
And it's great that he frames it, because he's so shocked that he drops the tomb, the stone that's covering the tomb, and it shatters in on the thing. And Donner films it in slow motion. It's just really, really well done.
Yeah.
And then the dogs attack, and it goes absolutely nuts from that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's like I said, the Omen builds those high spots, and it's got a lot of good stuff going on. But once it hits those high spots, it's just absolutely intense, and it's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And we didn't really talk about David Warner as the photographer, and in the first one. And the thing that I like about his role is that at the beginning, when we first start to see him, you start to wonder, it's like, what is it about him around? You almost think that maybe he's looking after Damien to a certain extent. And then you gradually start to realize that he's looking after Damien, but because of the fact that he has these suspicions that he's going to reveal the Thorn. And I love the way that character's developed over the course of the film.
Oh, it's great. And David Warner, another great actor in that cast, and he's just perfect in that role. And it's so funny because he shows up, the first time we see him is at the party when the first nanny kills herself. And he's like, "Oh, I guess we're here to, anoint the new child to the throne of the court of St. James," right?
Yeah.
Then shows up right before the priest shows up to talk to Thorne the first time. And that's where Thorne knocks his camera over and his camera breaks. And he says, "Hey, listen, just tell my aides, they'll get you a new camera." And he says, "Well, let's just say you owe me one." And that's how he gets him involved and gets him to come, and he explains the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it's crucial. It's really innovative the way they get him into the plot. And once he's in it, see, the best part of this is Thorne continues, even right up to the very, very end, to try to convince himself that this is just a kid and I shouldn't do this.
Yeah.
But Warner's character is convinced right from the start that, hey, we got to do something about this. These people are dying, and these glitches in my photographs. Now there's a photograph of me, which looks like I'm going to have my death coming shortly, and I want to avoid that. Yeah. But yeah, it's a really innovative way they set him in. I love it.
No, it's fantastic. And it's like I certainly had a new appreciation for the first one watching it, and I do have an appreciation for this trilogy now that I've seen it all. And I'm grateful. I have a feeling, because of the fact that I knew this was your favorite horror movie, we'd probably get here at some point in talking about it. And it's been really great to talk to you about it, and on this episode, as well as just over the years, just and starting to appreciate just basically kind of appreciating where this franchise is coming from. So I thank you for suggesting that we do this, or I can't remember who suggested it. I think I might have brought it up because of the fact that I knew it was your favorite horror movie, and the 45th anniversary was coming up, and then you might have brought up the trilogy. I don't know how it came up. I'm grateful that I know this franchise now, and I certainly have a more a greater appreciation for what this franchise does.
Well, look, I always appreciate the ability to talk about the Omen. Anytime I can say nice things about the Omen trilogy and get people to watch, the fact that I got you to watch the second and third one, that's a win for me right there. But I also appreciate you, and over the years we've done a bunch of these. Normally we talk about really shitty movies.
Yeah.
This time we happen to talk about a really great franchise with a kind of weak middle and decent ending there.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets me good. But again, thank you as always. Much appreciative. I always love being able to come on Sonic Cinema and talk with you about movies.
Yeah, this is actually one of the better sets of movies that we've been able to talk about, isn't it?
Yes, we were able to talk about the end of days in this franchise without actually talking about the movie End of Days. So that's a win right there.
This is very true. Yeah. But yeah, Phil, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Have a great day now, Brian.
All right. I'd like to thank Phil for joining me on the podcast today. It's always great to talk to him. We're going to have one more discussion this October. It's about 1996 horror movies, and that's going to be a fun talk for us to do. That's it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema podcast. There's going to be a lot of great things coming up in the last half of this year, including a long, in-depth discussion with Matthew Saliba about his larger body of work. And I hope you check that out. 1996 horror movies and 1996 in general. I'm going to start reaching out to people and trying to nail down a date to record that one and how that record is going to go. But also, we'll for sure have a podcast on documentaries, which I'm really looking forward to sharing with you guys. That's it for the Sonic Cinema podcast for this episode. My name's Brian Scuttle, and thank you for checking us out as always on www.sonic-cinema.com.